Hey everyone, and welcome to this podcast. We've been exploring Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theology, starting with Letters and Papers from Prison, and I'm most interested in what is called religionless Christianity. As we think about the gospel, as we think about the saving work of Jesus Christ and who God is in Jesus Christ, for me, it's a question of how does that get translated into the world today? How do we speak of the gospel today? And we're living in a time of culture wars where Christians on the left and the right are waging war against one another. And I actually think that there's a third way forward, that there's a way of being Christian and a way of being the church that tries to get beyond these ideological issues. And I think that Bonhoeffer helps us with this. I think Bonhoeffer is wrestling primarily with ideological issues. He's opposing Nazi ideology. And in this first part of discipleship, he's really getting at religious belief as abstraction. And as we think about cultural ideology, or this idea of doctrinal abstraction, I think that they're very similar to one another. What does it do? Well, what it does is it makes ideas, abstract ideas and concepts, the point. So that as long as we believe in these abstract ideas or doctrinal positions, that's what it means to have faith. And Bonhoeffer is challenging this. Now, he's actually influenced much by Kierkegaard here. For Kierkegaard, the question, of course, was always faith. And he was always concerned, especially in Fear and Trembling, that somehow we can get beyond faith. That we would say, oh yeah, we have faith, we believe, and now we got to get beyond that. And for Kierkegaard, faith is a lifetime wrestling with the revelation of who God is in Jesus Christ, because our lives are a wrestling, that we're responsible to live our life in the concrete, that we're called to love God and love our neighbor as we walk the path, and that we're responsible. We have to become responsible for making decisions, for loving our neighbor, for loving God. Of course, we do so in prayer and in worship. But too often what happens is Christianity gets abstracted. And so early in discipleship and in this chapter, he's talking about the difference between cheap grace and costly grace. Now, what is cheap grace? Cheap grace, as Bonhoeffer says, is grace as presupposition. It's the starting point. So we say, God has saved us in Jesus Christ. God has done all the work. We can't do anything. Or even in some Christian circles, this sense of humility, I would argue a false humility, that, oh, we're nothing. We can't do anything. God does everything, which then becomes justification to never change or to be transformed or to try or to have the courage to live a life, a spirit-filled life, in the midst of this world as we live our lives. And so when grace is a presupposition, when we start with grace, what it does is it allows us to never have to follow Jesus. That is Bonhoeffer's point. And here's what he writes. He says, like ravens, we have gathered around the carcass of cheap grace. From it, we have imbibed the poison which has killed the following of Jesus among us. Now, interestingly, Kierkegaard also talks about the church poisoning people. Now, he's writing at a time of Christendom in the Danish church where everybody's a Christian, the culture is Christian. And so really there's not much thought given to what it means to follow Jesus. And so he actually sees how the church is leading to a complacency. And Bonhoeffer is arguing the same thing about grace. Now, Bonhoeffer's context is entirely different. He's writing in the context of Nazi Germany and what's happening with the churches. But what he sees as the problem is cheap grace, that it never demands anything of us. So when it's confronted with something like the Nazification of Germany and the attempt by the Nazis to kind of overtake the churches and influence the churches, Bonhoeffer sees cheap grace as the culprit. Because they have lived with this for so long, there's no sense of what it means to take responsibility or to have courage or to to follow Jesus and to live in the midst of that concrete reality. And so he goes on. He says, the doctrine of pure grace experienced an unprecedented deification. The pure doctrine of grace became its own God, grace itself. Luther's teachings are quoted everywhere, but twisted from their truth into self-delusion. So I think this is really important. He's saying that the doctrine of grace became the point or the focal point, that it became deified. It became the thing that people were worshiping. And what it did then, again, is it allowed people to not actually have to change or be transformed. Later in that passage, he's referring to the Lutheran churches in Germany, where he says being Lutheran should mean that discipleship is left to the legalists or to the enthusiasts. In other words, to be Lutheran is to emphasize grace, and it's the Methodists and it's the others who have this kind of legalistic view of sanctification and living the Christian life. And Bonhoeffer is criticizing this, and that this becomes the foundation for the church to be infiltrated by all kinds of ideas, and then gives people cover to not have to push back or to not have to struggle to understand what it means to follow God and to love their neighbor. So he goes on and he says, but do we also know that this cheap grace has been utterly unmerciful against us? Is the price that we are paying today with the collapse of the organized churches anything else but an inevitable consequence of grace acquired too cheaply? We gave away preaching and sacraments cheaply. We performed baptisms and confirmations. We absolved an entire people, unquestioned and unconditionally. Out of human love, we handed over what was holy to the scornful and unbelievers. We poured out rivers of grace without end, but the call to rigorously follow Christ was seldom heard. At the heart of this for Bonhoeffer is this recognition that this cheap grace has allowed people to be part of the church, to consider themselves Christian, but to never be touched by transformation. And so he goes on, and it's interesting, something that gets referenced here. And so I want to read this and then go to a couple of other writings that I've found from some of Bonhoeffer's letters to emphasize what he's talking about. But so this is still in Discipleship. He says, what happened to Luther's warnings against a proclamation of the gospel which made people secure in their godless lives? Now, what I want to emphasize here is how versions of Christianity become affirmations of a cultural way of life. This happens on the left, it happens on the right. We can talk about liberal, we can talk about conservative. But what we end up doing is mistaking our way of life for discipleship. And that the gospel then, and going to church, becomes this thing that merely affirms our particular way of life. And this is what he is opposing. Now, he is opposing this in the context of Germany and Nazi Germany and the rise of an emphasis on a German church, a folk religion that emphasized, German identity over and against what Bonhoeffer would say is Christian identity. And I don't think it's too far for us to see how that might happen to us here today in 21st century America. As we think about how Christianity has been used as a weapon to bludgeon, how people are being accused of not being Christian enough or being accused of being Marxist because they want to talk about social justice, or they want to talk about racism, or they want to talk about how we should treat LGBTQ people, or how we should treat single mothers or people who end up in a dire situation through unwanted pregnancy. People ask questions about what is our responsibility towards these groups of people or to our neighbor who fall into these different categories, and they get accused of being liberal or being Marxist or whatever. And then we treat our culture as though it is divinely ordained. And this is exactly what Bonhoeffer is fighting in Nazi Germany. There's a sense in which German culture is replacing the gospel. And so he goes on and he says, when was the world ever Christianized more dreadfully and wickedly than here? And so again, he's recognizing that this term Christian is being used as a weapon of sorts to define who truly is Christian. And beneath it is an emphasis upon kind of national identity or folk identity. And he goes on and he says, what do the 3,000 Saxons whose bodies Charlemagne killed compare with the millions of souls being killed today? The biblical wisdom that the sins of the fathers are visited on the children into the third and fourth generation has become true in us. Cheap grace was very unmerciful to our Protestant church. Now, why is he mentioning Charlemagne here? Well, in this version of Discipleship, the Fortress Press version, when you go down to the bottom, you read a footnote that says, in 782, Charlemagne had thousands of people from the Saxon tribe executed. The National Socialist propaganda machine used this historical fact against the church. So the Nazis are using this fact about Charlemagne and the Saxons against the church. And what Bonhoeffer is doing, so he makes reference to it. And what he's doing is he's saying what's worse than that is the millions of souls that are being lost because of complacency. Because they are buying into the Nazi ideology and they're replacing the gospel with cultural ideology. There's an interesting letter that Bonhoeffer writes to his grandmother that helps us unpack this a little more and see what Bonhoeffer's concern is here. So here's the letter that he writes his grandma. He says, our work here is very enjoyable and also very demanding. We want to try to make the German Christians declare their intentions. So he's telling his grandma, we're trying to get these different churches who are giving into the Nazi ideology to finally become open about what it is that they're doing. He says, I rather doubt we shall succeed. Even if at this point they make concessions in their official formulations, they're under such strong pressure that they sooner or later any promises made are bound to break down. It's becoming increasingly clear to me that what we're going to get is a big Völkisch national church that in its essence can no longer be reconciled with Christianity, and that we must make up our minds to take entirely new paths and follow where they lead. In other words, the churches in Germany are giving in to this kind of national identity, this German Völkisch church, a folk religion grounded in German identity that Bonhoeffer sees is not compatible with Christianity or the gospel. And he is saying that they have to take new paths, that there has to be another way to talk about the gospel and to talk about Christianity and to be the church. And again, what I want to suggest here is that beneath all of this is this cheap grace, costly grace conversation. It is cheap grace that allows this to take root because it's all grace. We don't have to really follow Jesus. It doesn't demand anything of us. And then he goes on to say this. The issue is really Germanism or Christianity. And the sooner the conflict comes out in the open, the better. The greatest danger of all would be in trying to conceal this. In our own context, there's this sense in which what is more important? Is it a national identity, an American identity? Do we want to prevent immigrants from coming to this country? Again, I think there's a resonance here. And it fits, I think, with Bonhoeffer's primary concern that the gospel transcends national identity. The gospel transcends our political identity, that we are first and foremost Christians, that we are Christians bound together by the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that we must hold our national identity loosely. And yet we can see continually how Christian doctrine, Christian beliefs are being weaponized to push certain people out and declare who is orthodox, who is faithful to the church. And that's all getting wrapped up in some sense with American identity. So I want to end with this paragraph, and this is at the end of this chapter on costly grace. He says, in everything that follows, he's speaking about his book, Discipleship, we want to speak up on behalf of those who are tempted to despair, for whom the word of grace has become frightfully empty, or for those who wake up one day and can't believe that their Christian brothers and sisters are advocating for certain things, or are talking about their immigrant neighbors in a certain way. And there's a sense in which it's like, what is happening? What does it mean to be a Christian today? What does it mean to take the gospel seriously? This is Bonhoeffer's concern. For integrity's sake, someone has to speak up for those among us who confess that cheap grace has made them give up following Christ, and that ceasing to follow Christ has made them lose the knowledge of costly grace. In some sense, when people look at the church and look at the Christian community and see this cheap grace, it turns them away. And they're never able to come to a true understanding of the costly grace, the discipleship, of what it truly means to follow Jesus. I tell my kids this, or I've told my kids this since they were young, that oftentimes the Christianity that they're seeing is not the gospel. And so I beg of them to not give up on Christian faith, to not give up on the church, but to dig deeply into and think deeply about what it means to follow Jesus in this world. So he goes on. Because we cannot deny that we no longer stand in true discipleship to Christ, while being members of a true believing church with a pure doctrine of grace, but no longer members of a church which follows Christ, we therefore simply have to try to understand grace and discipleship again in correct relationship to each other. We can no longer avoid this. Our church's predicament is proving more and more clearly to be a question of how we are to live as Christians today. He's putting out a call in his own time to say, look, we see that our churches have embraced cheap grace, and in doing so have abdicated their responsibility. And now we're seeing the consequences of that. We're seeing the consequences of a church that is seeing itself primarily through national identity and all of these abstract ideas, and not according to the gospel. And he's saying to them, it's time for us now to put grace and discipleship in proper relationship. And it's time for us now to begin to think and reflect upon what this looks like and what it means to follow Jesus, to live as Christians, to live a life of discipleship. This is what he's doing in this book. And this is why I think he speaks to the church today. In the same way, we look at our churches who are obsessed with all kinds of things, on the right, on the left, and are turning these moral principles, doctrinal principles, into the main thing. And in the same way, Bonhoeffer says to us, look, being a Christian is not about being an American, not about being an evangelical. It's not about having the right sexual ethics. It's about following Jesus. It's about learning what it means to love God and love our neighbor in the concrete world, and to live out our faith with fear and trembling, and to recognize that we are called to step out of all of these ideologies. Bonhoeffer is saying we are being called to be a Christian. We are called into the concrete reality of our neighbor's life, and we're called to work out what that means. This is the life of discipleship, and this is the life of costly grace.